It's wonderful to be in Colorado, here in Durango. And Karen and I, my wife Karen is here with me, came in from the snowlands of South Bend and Chicago. And first thing when we got off the plane, there's no snow in the ground. The temperature is above freezing. So it's really been wonderful. But most of all, I've really enjoyed the warmth of the reception and hospitality and getting to meet all of you wonderful students and the great questions you were asking during the day today. So hopefully by tonight we'll come up with some answers to those good questions. And I apologize for wearing my cap. I've been going through some skin treatments from the dermatologist, and it's created quite a bit of rash on my forehead. And I figured you don't want to look at my forehead, so I'll put my cap on here. So,
you really don't.
So what I want to do tonight is say a few words of introduction about myself. And then I want to go through some of the basic principles of nonviolence. What is it? What do we understand to be how nonviolence works and what are its capabilities? And I want to go through some of the new empirical data that's become available over the last couple of years to show the power of nonviolence and its significance as a way of bringing about political change. Then I want to briefly review a couple of the most recent cases, the Egyptian revolution and also the recent events in Ukraine and the Maidan, and talk about how we've seen again the enormous impact that civil resistance, nonviolent methods can have. And then at the end I want to talk about the relevance of nonviolence for dealing with the problem of countering terrorism, and to make the case that nonviolence does have answers that are relevant to even these most difficult international security challenges preventing violence. So here I have the shameless self-promotion of my book. I know the students have been assigned, they have to read it, so, but hopefully some of you will be able to also pick it up. As Eric mentioned, I got my start in peace studies in a most unusual way by being drafted into the US Army. It was the summer of 1968. I had just graduated from Notre Dame, so I'm an undergraduate from Notre Dame as well. Hadn't really thought about what I was going to do with my life, but Uncle Sam had a plan. And I graduated in June 2nd or something like that, 1968. Within 3 days, I received my notice to report for the physical for the Army draft. And within a couple of weeks, I was crawling through the sands of Fort Dix in basic training in the US Army. It was a head-spinning experience, completely turned my life upside down. And when I went in, I was really not political. I came from a very conservative, Catholic, working-class community. I was not political in any way. I went into the Army. Everybody else goes into the Army. Why not me? But once I was in and I began to hear what the soldiers who were coming back from Vietnam were saying and talking to the veterans and learning what was really going on there, the more I began to have questions. And then I did something very subversive as a soldier. I started to read books about the history of Vietnam. And within the first couple hours of reading a couple of major history books, I realized that what the government was telling us was not correct. And there were a whole series of assumptions that didn't make sense. So the more this went on and the more I learned about the depth of the injustice of this war. And it was not just a mistake, but a profound injustice, and even to realize that we were committing crimes in Indochina, I became totally consumed with the disaster that I was entering in terms of being part of such an enterprise. And I just simply couldn't accept it. And I went through a real personal crisis. I couldn't sleep at night. I was angry. I was just constantly struggling for what I was going to do. Should I desert? Should I become a conscientious objector? I was a Catholic, and Catholics are not pacifist, and so only if you're a pure pacifist can you become a conscientious objector, so that didn't really fit for me. And then, as Eric said, I saw a notice about other soldiers speaking out against the war, and I finally realized this is something that I had to do. I had to commit myself, and regardless of the consequences, I knew full well that Army commanders are not fond of their soldiers talking back to them about the policies in which we're supposed to be serving. But I could not go on with business as usual. And so I began to speak out. And there were lots of other soldiers, this was 1968, late 68, who had similar concerns and doubts about the war, and we became part of the GI peace movement, the soldiers' peace movement, active duty soldiers speaking out against the war inside the military. And there were also lots of veterans who were coming back from Vietnam who were also speaking out. And of course, the most famous is Secretary of State John Kerry, part of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. So that's how I got my start in peace studies, a very unusual approach. And the more I became part of this movement, the more deeply committed I was to trying to prevent war. And I studied it more deeply, and I've really dedicated my whole life to the task of trying to prevent war, to try to build peace, and to try to understand nonviolence. And as we try to understand nonviolence, we inevitably address the enormous contributions of Gandhi, really the pioneer in the development of mass nonviolent civil disobedience as a means of political change. Gandhi, of whom Albert Einstein wrote, "Generations from now will scarcely believe that such a one as this ever in flesh and blood walked upon this earth." And he did, of course, and he did more than walk. He marched, he led demonstrations, he organized hundreds of millions of people in India to say no to British colonial rule. And without firing a shot, with no army, no large structure, no big organization and money, he was able to bring down what was considered to be the greatest empire in the world in terms of its rule in India. An amazing accomplishment. And Gandhi was able to develop the principles of organized, disciplined, mass nonviolent resistance as a method for political change. And all of us who now work in this field essentially are following in his footsteps and trying to apply the models that he developed. Gandhi's a difficult person to study. He was so austere as a personality. You know, he was a complete pacifist. He began to give up his Western clothes and then pretty much gave up all clothes, gave up sex. He was a strict vegetarian. You know, the kind of person you figure he wouldn't have been much fun to hang out with. But he was somewhat humorous. He had some occasional jokes, and so I'll share a couple with you. There are not that many, so... So as you may know the history, in 1930 and 31 they had the Great Salt March, and they really brought the English rule, the Raj, to its knees for a while in terms of the power of the resistance. And they were invited to London for the round table negotiations about the future of rule in India. So Gandhi went to London and he participated in the talks, and he was given an appointment at Buckingham Palace to meet the king. So at the appointed hour he showed up in the chilly weather of London in his loincloth and sandals. And of course the press was all gathered around, and Gandhi comes strolling up, and they're all shocked, and they say, "Mr. Gandhi, don't you think you're a little underdressed for the occasion?" And he said, "Well, that's all right. I'm sure His Majesty has on enough clothes for both of us." And during that trip, he was also asked by the reporters, "So, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization?" He said, "I think it would be a very good idea." But he was there helping to lead this delegation, and he spent a lot of his time not so much meeting with the delegates from the British government, but meeting with civil society, meeting with Charlie Chaplin, meeting with other famous people in British society, and appealing to the people, just as he did in India. He went over the heads of governments around them and appealed to people to take action. And he appealed to the solidarity of many people in Great Britain who supported the right of the Indian people to win their freedom. So he really, as I say, pioneered these methods and played a key role in developing what we now know as the methods of civil resistance. And these same methods then greatly influenced Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was another pioneer who really played a key role, of course, not only in helping to end racial segregation in the United States, but in bringing the Gandhian method into modern society, into an urban setting. and putting it in the context of Christian teaching as opposed to Gandhi's primary influences being within the Hindu tradition. And Dr. King often referred to Gandhi as an influence on his work. He had a photo of Gandhi in his office, and he took these methods of civil resistance, used some of the techniques and strategies of Gandhi, such as boycotts and withdrawing of support from government institutions, and applied them in the American South in the great struggle for freedom. And he especially adopted the Gandhian principle of disciplined nonviolence and refusing to retaliate against repression, and understood and applied in Montgomery and in Birmingham and Selma and all the great arenas of struggle during the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, the idea that when you are facing repression and you are able to withstand repression without retaliating, instead of actually losing, you're gaining. Because the other side, by excessively responding to your resistance, by using brutalized force against disciplined, dignified, nonviolent action, undermines its own credibility. And the nonviolent force is able to gain sympathy and support from the public. So it's this kind of upside-down reality that when you're being clubbed and beaten by the police, you're actually winning. And the other side that uses its armed forces, when it does employ them, undermines its own position. A profound insight that has now been applied really at a global level in terms of nonviolence. And now this method has been applied with more and more relevance and power all around the world. And we can see that the use of nonviolent resistance is accelerating and has now become the primary means by which people who are oppressed are fighting for their freedom. And there are some key principles. I won't go through the whole set of ideas of Gandhianism and King's philosophy, but just a few points here. This first point about the pursuit of truth and justice is important because many people equate Gandhian nonviolence and Dr. King's methods with pure pacifism, and the idea that this is a passive resistance. You still see the media sometimes referring to it as passive resistance. Gandhi hated that phrase. He said, "There's nothing passive about my method. We are actively resisting British oppression, but we're doing it with other weapons, the weapons of nonviolence, through press action, through legal action, through non-cooperation." And he also made the point that, and through his example, illustrated that nonviolence is not really about war and peace. Gandhi was a pacifist, but he never was involved in campaignings against war. He was fighting for justice for his people. How many of you have seen the great movie about Gandhi, the Attenborough film, Gandhi? Some of you have. And you remember the opening scene. It shows the image, the episode when Gandhi was first in South Africa. He's taking a train to begin work as a lawyer in a major firm, Johannesburg. And he's thrown off the train, even though he has a first-class ticket, because he's colored. So he experiences race oppression directly. And he's angry. And he wants to fight back. But he fights back with this nonviolent method. And he begins to work through the different ways in which they can fight back effectively. And that idea of nonviolent resistance emerged from that kind of an experience, and the experience of oppression of the Indian community in South Africa. And he said that this is the tool for fighting against oppression and injustice. It's not about pacifism. It's not about passivity. It's an active form of resistance, and its primary purpose, as I say, is to pursue the truth, to uphold the truth, and to achieve justice. The other principle, the second one here, is obvious to us. We know about this, that ends and means must be compatible. That one cannot achieve just ends with unjust means. And that the means we use are going to determine the kinds of ends we realize. And it's a simple idea, but it has profound implication. And it's really completely contrary to the conventional political ethic of normal politics and certainly of military action. But it's crucial to the importance of nonviolence. And Gandhi said that we can't always know what the ends of our action will be. It's indeterminate, it's in the future. But the means we employ today, we have control over. We know that. And if we focus on those means, and if they are just, we have a greater chance of bringing about a just ends. This question of a willingness to sacrifice is critically important. And this comes from a recognition that those who have power, those who have privilege, do not give up their power and privilege willingly or easily. It's always a struggle. And when you resist and try to challenge the power of the great forces that are in charge of institutions and governments, they will fight against you. They will repress you. And there's studies that show as many as 90% of the major nonviolent resistance campaigns do face repression from the government, sometimes violent repression. You have to be prepared for this and be willing to accept it without retaliating in kind. And it's key to that dynamic I was mentioning earlier, where the power of the oppressor diminishes, the authority and the political support for the challenging movement increases. And then lastly, the nonviolent discipline. Absolutely crucial to maintain a complete nonviolent approach. There can be no violation of this principle in order for the method to be effective. And this is not a moral principle, although, as I say, Gandhi and King did have religious pacifist beliefs. It's a practical consideration. If you want to maintain the dignity of your movement in order to trigger that effect where the adversary undermines its position, you gain authority in your position, you have to be disciplined in your nonviolence. And you can think about in our own US experience, the lunch counter sit-in campaigns of the civil rights movement. Maybe we've all seen documentary footage of this. The students who went to that Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. There's a wonderful museum down there, by the way, and if you have a chance, go down and check it out. The lunch counter is still preserved. And they knew they were going to be beaten up by the thugs and they would be arrested. And they came prepared. They dressed up. The boys put on good shirts. The gals had nice dresses. They brought their schoolwork with them. They were disciplined. They were dignified. And sure enough, they were attacked. You've seen the footage in documentary films. And they completely refused to retaliate. But they were successful. They won the sympathy of the country and eventually were politically successful. So nonviolent discipline is key to the effectiveness of this method. So as I mentioned, this has become really the go-to option for social struggle around the world. And this book recently by Peter Ackerman and Jack Duvall summarizes some of the cases. And I like the phrase especially. And it really comes to the theme that I want to begin to address now, the power of nonviolence and the empirical evidence that's beginning to emerge to show that it is, in fact, a superior and more effective method. Often people resort to armed struggle when they're facing oppression. These images from the civil war in Syria. And who can blame them? Protesters demonstrated against the Assad regime. And what did they meet? Brutal, violent repression from the government. Hundreds are being shot down in the streets. And at the end of the day, finally, people's patience broke and they resorted to armed force. And the result has been unbelievably horrific, the devastation, 130,000 or more killed. And as I say, we're not in a position to condemn that decision to pick up arms. But one thing we can say, then when you make a decision to go with armed struggle, your chances of success diminish. Armed struggle rarely, if ever, works. And if it does, quote, work, it brings with it such vast suffering and devastation that one can begin to question whether it was really worth it. New evidence has emerged, as I mentioned, from Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan on the power of nonviolence. This study is the first to try to do a quantitative analysis of major social resistance campaigns going back over 100 years. 300 cases that they examined. And they asked, okay, let's look at these major cases. Which ones were successful, which were not, and then which methods, nonviolence versus violence, were used, and then measure which was more effective. And the results speak for themselves. It's extraordinary. And it really was quite a shock. Professor Chenoweth, I've gotten to know, and she said that when she started this study, she was a skeptic. You know, there was all the moral, nonviolent proponents saying this is the better method, and she said, I don't believe it. And then a colleague said, well, why don't you go see if you can prove it by social science comparative analysis methods. So being a good political scientist, she got a database that ran the numbers and looked at them and then ran the numbers again. This can't be right. And they've been running them several times since. They now have a new database. Well, now it's a public database, NAVCO it's called. You can access it online. And what they found is now well established. Nonviolent methods are more effective. I'll do questions later. Is that all right? Yeah, I'll come back to that. But not only is it more effective in terms of the likelihood of success, research by other colleagues, Ackerman and Ariane Karatnicki, have found that nonviolent transformations, political transitions, tend to be more likely to create a free and democratic society. And you can see the results here. It's really quite striking. Transitions that are by nonviolent means tend to be societies that are free or partly free. These are the Freedom House ratings. They're well-known, traditional use, and go back many decades. Whereas struggles that utilize armed means tend to have a partly free or more repressive government, which you could say it in a simple way. Those who win by the gun tend to rule by the gun. Those who win by mass social action tend to be more open to mass social democracy and free society. So we now have evidence to kind of confirm what Gandhi and others were trying to say in their day, that nonviolence is a more effective means. And we also know that it's more likely to produce a freer and democratic society. Now let me say a few words about these recent cases that have been so dramatic in recent history. The Egyptian Revolution. Karen and I went to Egypt soon after the revolution. We had a conference at the University of Cairo, met with many of those who were participating this is 2011, and really tried to understand how this revolution took place. And we found that many of the principles of Gandhi and King that we had studied were being applied. Although I doubt that there was a single person in all of those masses of people demonstrating who had really studied these techniques. But they just knew intuitively that to try to fight against the Mubarak dictatorship by military means would have been suicidal. They had experienced the terrorist movements in Egypt that had killed President Sadat. And then what did they get? Another dictator. After one military dictator comes another. So they felt that they had to try a different approach. And through 18 days of extraordinary social action, they were able to bring down the regime. It was a bitter struggle. They faced brutal police repression. Hundreds were killed by the police. And we found as we looked at the revolution that while it generally followed the pattern of Gandhi, it really wasn't truly a Gandhian movement. I had actually been thinking about writing a book at this time, and the publisher said, okay, I've got a great title, Gandhi on the Nile. I said, well, that's great. But then when I went there and I studied, I realized, well, they weren't really following the Gandhian script. And we described this in a study that we did as an unarmed revolution, but not a completely nonviolent revolution, because they did throw stones. And they did use fire bombs, not against the police here, but to burn down police buildings and to damage police cars and government buildings. So there was a kind of violence being used in this revolution, although it was unarmed, and it did have the general characteristics of nonviolent resistance. But the revolution obviously has gone sour, and I think many strategic mistakes have been made on both sides, by the government and by the civil resistance movement. That's a whole other discussion. We're still doing research on this to try to understand exactly what happened. But we do know that the people in the streets were fed up by the Muslim Brotherhood government, by President Morsi, and organized an even larger movement of demonstrations in June of this past year, and were able to overthrow the Morsi government. The problem is, Morsi was, whether you liked him or not, he was elected, and it was a constitutional process. And there were elections coming up a few months after this for parliament, in which almost certainly the Islamic Brotherhood government was going to lose some seats, because they were doing a terrible job, not delivering the goods, not helping people, and they were becoming more and more authoritarian. They were very unpopular, hence this mass crowd. But they moved instead to try to drive him out of the government, and they believed naively that the military would be their friend and would help them. And you know the story. The military took over, the protests continued, and there have been terrible massacres in the streets. And the Egyptian revolution at this point, you'd have to say, is a failure. Although the movement remains alive, and it's unlikely that the people will be quiet. So further chapters yet will be written about the Egyptian revolution, I'm sure. Then, of course, we come to the Maidan, just over the last few weeks, but this protest, of course, have been going on for months. And just in the last week, they have succeeded in overthrowing the government. And again, it's a revolution that is not exactly a Gandhian revolution, and I think it ventured and veered further away from the Gandhian model even than in Egypt. There was a lot of brick throwing, there was a lot of firebombing. Some policemen, Ukrainian policemen, were killed. We don't know yet all the data in terms of all the circumstances, but nonetheless, it was an enormously powerful movement. They developed all sorts of interesting tactics, armored civilian protesters. But they had to do this to withstand the violent attack that they faced with the Ukrainian security forces. They were almost entirely unarmed. So they did follow that dimension of the Gandhian movement, and almost everybody was disciplined in that commitment to a nonviolent approach. But not everybody. So I say almost everybody. And then they had this, right at the end, this incredible ring of fire. You saw maybe some of the documentary footage of it, where they had a big ring of fire around their encampment in the Maidan to defend themselves from the police attack. I mean, these tactics were successful. They managed to stay there in the streets despite a pretty massive and brutal attack by the security forces that went on for days. And ultimately, of course, they have been successful in overthrowing the government. But then, now they face the consequences of Putin's intervention and this very dangerous military maneuver by the Russians to try to manipulate and control. And the students have been asking me all day, what do we think about the Ukrainian revolution and now the Russian intervention? I don't think we know quite enough yet to say. We're not sure what's going on, but it's a very dangerous situation. And I think the new Ukrainian government is realizing that they need to be a little bit more compromising in their approach with the pro-Russian part of the Ukrainian population. And then hopefully diplomacy can help to convince the Russians that they need to back off in terms of their attempt to take over Crimea. But it's a very volatile and dangerous situation that we're facing in the world today in this crisis in Ukraine and Russia and Crimea. But nonetheless, I think while the history is changing, it's not as simple as it was even just a couple of years ago and the pattern of what nonviolence is about. I think the core findings that I was presenting earlier still hold, that this is an effective method of resistance. And even in these cases of very brutal repression, people united and massed in the streets and willing to sacrifice are able to overthrow regimes, corrupt and dictatorial regimes. So I want to just quickly segue then to the last part of my talk, which is the relevance of nonviolence, I would argue, for this struggle against global terrorism, because I think nonviolence is a method that's effective not only in social transformation, political transformation within countries, but in addressing political crises and the threats of violence between countries internationally. And especially in the struggle that's been so central to US politics over the last 13 years, the countering terrorism and Al-Qaeda. Oops, come back to this. So here's some empirical data that I wanted to share with you that I often try to cite. As you know, after 9/11, our government opted for a global war on terror approach, invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, a primary reliance on military force as a way of countering terrorism. A few years ago, the RAND Corporation, how many of you know about the RAND Corporation? It's a big Pentagon think tank. It's not a peace study center. They did a study and they asked a very good question. Let's look at how terrorist groups have ended in recent history and then try to categorize what methods were used to bring these terrorist groups to an end. And the results here are obvious. Two major factors. Policing, which means good old-fashioned law enforcement, the use of police methods. And then politicization, or one could say political processes, negotiations, of which, of course, very well-known example is the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland, a political negotiation that took a long time but has been successful in bringing the IRA out of the terrorism business, and the Irish Republican movement has now moved more into conventional politics, and the killings have mostly come to an end. Policing and international law enforcement is also another critical factor. I'll give you one very important example of this. It's a story that's not well known, but it was a little bit in the press. As you may have read, if you were following closely, in 2006, there was a plot that was uncovered by Al-Qaeda-related terrorists who were living in London, around in England, in the northern part of England, sorry, to try to bring down as many as a dozen planes flying from Heathrow to the United States. Would have killed thousands of people. This plot was uncovered through police work, and I happened to be at an international counterterrorism conference right after that. And I was one of the people at the conference was the superintendent of deputies at Scotland Yard. And we were walking around after the conference, and I said, well, how did you do this? It's amazing. And he described it, and part of it was cooperation with the law enforcement people in Pakistan and in other Arab countries, and with the US and with Germany. And part of it was the bobbies on the street in some of the towns in northern England who were walking through the streets in these mostly Muslim neighborhoods, and people were saying, you know, there's some strange guys coming to mosque, and they're saying some very violent things, and you maybe want to check it out. And there's these guys who are meeting down at the house at the end of the street, and they really seem to be up to some nefarious activities. You might check it out. So the police began to follow the leads, did investigation, and sure enough, they were able to uncover this plot, came in, arrested all these people before they were able to take action, saved thousands of lives. There's a new story about this that Mark Mazzetti writes in his new book, The Edge of the Knife, about the CIA, which is a useful story on it. He tells it in just a one-page summary. But there are many, many other cases. I've been, as I say, to a number of these counterterrorism, anti-terrorism conferences around the world, and every day, as we're sitting here tonight, there is a war against terrorism going on, but it's an intelligence war. It's a police cooperation war. It's officials of the FBI and of their counterparts in Pakistan and Germany and Indonesia and all around the world. Police and intelligent people cooperating to track down these violent extremists, bring them to justice, and save people's lives. These are the effective ways of ending terrorism. Military force has tended not to work and not been the main way in which these groups have come to an end. And we've sadly learned through our own experience in Iraq and Afghanistan that with all the sacrifice and the great effort of our men and women in uniform, we've not really been able to bring justice or orderly societies to these places. And the threat of Al-Qaeda, while it's diminished in Afghanistan, has spread to other places So the use of military force is really not the effective way. We need a better concept of the strategy. And this graphic tries to illustrate that. And it obviously creates this image of concentric circles. The problem are these active terrorist networks which exist in communities in many parts of the world. And they are able to operate because they have either the support or the acquiescence of surrounding communities. And think about what this means. So in Iraq and Afghanistan and now unfortunately other places, there are people out planting road bombs, trying to blow up government forces or unfortunately some of our own troops. So what if someone were doing that in one of our neighborhoods? Everyone would know it immediately. They would report it to the police. No one could possibly get away with something like that. But people are watching while this is going on, and they're either silently cheering it on or they're accepting it in one way or another. That's the dynamic, unfortunately, that exists in many of these societies. These groups cannot operate, insurgent groups cannot operate without support from the communities. And they support these terrorist groups because either they don't want foreign troops in their country, or because the local governments are completely corrupt and repressive. Afghanistan, unfortunately, we're supporting a government that's like that. So they have nowhere else to turn. These extremist groups come along and say, we'll address the problems, and people will sometimes go along with that or even support it. What we need to do is create a dynamic where the communities are turning away from these extremist groups. What I was mentioning in normal life in Northern England, people don't support these groups. And if they have even the slightest hint that they're around, they'll report them to the police. And to give an alternative to communities, which means basically a better governance system, less corruption, more accountable systems, more voice for their people to be able to determine the decisions that affect their lives. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in many places, and that really is the core need and the ways of countering these violent extremist groups. Most people don't know, but the UN has been developing a counterterrorism strategy. Some of my colleagues and I were helping to participate in the deliberations on this, and this quickly summarizes it. And you see that under the UN strategy, the first principle is to address conditions conducive, to try to understand why it is that some people in communities will take up this kind of activity, will even kill themselves in order to kill other people. And we know a lot about this, a lack of effective governance, lack of jobs, lack of education, grotesque inequalities, communities that feel excluded. Many of these factors we know about. Those are the conditions that give rise to violence, and we need to address them. Prevention and control, things that I was just mentioning about police activities, law enforcement, they are necessary. And building state and international capacity so that governments have not only good security and police operations, but also the ability to deliver necessary social services to their communities, to provide education, to be able to provide health care and other necessary social goods. And then lastly, and very importantly, that we need to respect human rights and the rule of law. Unfortunately, in our country and many other countries now, there has been an assumption that in order to go after the terrorists, we have to sacrifice some of our liberties. And we've seen how some of the intelligence and other agencies have taken advantage of this and collecting all of our cell phone data and spying, and it's getting out of hand. And it's not necessary. We can respect and maintain our freedoms and human rights while fighting against the extremists. Indeed, I would argue that human rights and the rule of law are the best weapon against those who by their very nature violate every human right and every principle of the law. There are a range of non-military measures that can be used against these terrorist groups. I've talked about law enforcement. Sanctions are being used. My colleague George Lopez and I have done a lot of work on targeted sanctions over the years. And these measures are enforced in many countries to try to freeze the assets, to prevent transfers of arms, to prevent the travel of those who are associated with these violent extremist groups. And by themselves, they're not going to be the whole answer, but in combination with other measures, they can make a difference. Improving border controls in many of these states. This is part of the problem of a lack of governance, the fact that governments don't really have control over their territory. Police and intelligence cooperation that I mentioned, and tightening up the control on international flows of financing, because ultimately these groups need money to operate, and there are enormous efforts underway internationally to try to track international financial transactions to prevent money going to these kinds of organizations. But we really need to get at the deeper conditions conducive, which means prevention. And these are the longer term challenges, and they're very difficult. And this is what peace and conflict studies is all about in many respects. We're trying to understand those basic root causes and see what can be done to address them. And we know that one of them, as I mentioned earlier, is the unmet political grievances that groups have all over the world. And we have plenty of them here in our own country. But at least we have methods. We can go and lobby and raise hell in the streets and write editorials and file lawsuits and a whole range of other things. In a lot of places in the world, those methods aren't available, or people are rejected. And when people have grievances, they will find some way to express them and fight to right the wrong that they perceive. And if they don't have nonviolent political means, they will use violent extremist methods. We also need to, as I've emphasized, improve governance as a broad framework of understanding these problems. Governance is a whole range of things. It means more representative and democratic institutions. It means inclusive institutions that do not exclude communities. It means providing economic opportunity, economic freedom, so everyone can have a chance to improve their well-being. We've learned that gender equality is an essential dimension of governance for peace. That societies where women are more equal, where they have opportunities economically, socially, politically, those are societies that tend to be more peaceful, less prone to extremist violence. And as I mentioned, expanding economic and social opportunity. Ultimately, what it comes down to, as I try to bring my remarks here to an end, is we're talking about the need for addressing the injustices, the repressive conditions that give rise to these extremist movements. And here we come back to that original theme of Gandhi. Nonviolence is a method of resisting injustice. And nonviolent tools are available for overcoming violent extremism. And I'll close with this quote, I think coming from a Catholic school, I guess I'm allowed to quote the Pope. Soon I'm going to have a quote from Pope Francis here, looking at his writings now for this purpose. But it really is a profound truth. If we want peace, if we want to prevent violence, we have to work for justice. Thank you very much.